Hello and welcome to another episode of Portrait of a Superhero, and in this issue I'll be focusing on the artwork of one of my earliest and favourite comic book characters, the Amazing Spider-Man. It therefore brings me great pleasure to take you through this chronological appreciation of some of my favourite artistic depictions of the web-slinger since his inception in 1962. In 1962, Marvel Comics editor and head writer Stan Lee wanted to create a character with whom teenagers could identify with, and thus the idea for Spider-Man was born. The first artist to depict this character was Steve Ditko, and despite not being Stan Lee's first choice, Ditko would envision the character's trademark look, web shooters, and wall-crawling abilities. Ditko's costume design was integral to the character's success, as it would completely cover his body, making him look like a living cartoon. Therefore, teenage readers could identify with a hero who would suit up not only to save people, but to escape from his own real-world problems. It did not matter what race, and to an extent what gender we were, we could all be Spider-Man. However, upon closer inspection, Ditko's costume did offer audiences visual clues that expressed the character's mood. By cleverly following the features of the face with the costume's webbing line pattern, Ditko would create a visual language for the masked character. Therefore, a smile would angle the webbing line upwards, where a frown would do the opposite, and the eyes would widen to express shock, etc. In fact, this costume design proved so successful that it still remains fairly consistent with modern incarnations of the character. Ditko's visualization would ultimately get its debut in Amazing Fantasy number 15, and the artist would continue to ink and draw the character in 41 issues over 3 years. Arguably the most eye-catching of his designs included Spider-Man number 23, where the wall-crawler acrobatically evades his nemesis. I'm also a huge fan of the cover art of Amazing Spider-Man number 28, which depicts the web-slinger in dark shadow. Despite his huge success, Ditko abruptly quit working for Marvel after Amazing Spider-Man number 38. Due to this, Stan Lee would hire John Romita Sr., who initiated a new comic book era, giving the character a more fleshed out muscular look with geometric perfection. In my opinion, some of Romita's most iconic cover art includes that of Amazing Spider-Man number 50, where a disillusioned Peter Parker decides to end his days as Spider-Man. The comic's cover perfectly exhibits the challenges a young man would face trying to juggle his personal life with his responsibilities as a superhero. Romita's poignant style would surface again on the cover of Amazing Spider-Man number 75 before he would offer us the magnificent Amazing Spider-Man number 100, 100th anniversary issue. In 1968, Romita continued to draw the character's extra-long stories in the comics magazine The Spectacular Spider-Man. This proto-graphic novel was designed to appeal to an older readership and became the first Spider-Man spin-off publication. Additionally, he created the cover art on the Spectacular Spider-Man Marvel Treasury Edition number 1, which is also a personal favourite. Another significant moment for the depiction of Spider-Man came in 1968, when Ross Andru was brought in to do a fill-in issue of Amazing Spider-Man for John Romita Sr., who had injured his wrist. Andru would impress Marvel and went on to receive his proper Amazing Spider-Man debut in 1973. His 5-year run would include penciling the debut of The Punisher and illustrating the rare company crossover Superman vs. Amazing Spider-Man in 1978. Andru's attention to detail and depictions of the New York skyline saw him receive notoriety amongst artists as he went on to epitomize the look of Spider-Man during the 70s. This versatile illustrator would enhance the superhero element of the character, allowing the writers he collaborated with to create more diverse storylines that matched the imagery. One such example is the awe-inspiring cover of Amazing Spider-Man number 178, which portrays Spider-Man's race against time to save his Aunt May. Quite possibly one of the most accomplished artists of his day, Gil Kane is regarded as a member of the driving forces behind Spider-Man becoming Marvel's flagship character. Kane would take the reins from Romita Sr. in 1970 and illustrate the Amazing Spider-Man for 6 years. Gil would work on several landmark moments in the wall crawler's career, which included the 3-issue anti-drug story arc in the Amazing Spider-Man number 96 to 98. Kane would also pencil the pages of Amazing Spider-Man number 121 to 122, better known as the night Gwen Stacy died. Some of my favourite Gil Kane cover art are the issues where new characters were dramatically introduced, including Morbius in Amazing Spider-Man number 101, as well as the Punisher in Amazing Spider-Man number 129. Living up to your father can always be difficult, especially if he is John Romita, but John Romita Jr. did exactly that with Spider-Man. During the early 1980s, Romita Jr. would establish himself as a serious Spider-Man illustrator with classics like Amazing Spider-Man number 230 and 236. However, my personal favourite is when he collaborated with his father. This father and son dream team would create the cover of Amazing Spider-Man number 238, with Junior penciling and the ink being applied by John Romita Sr. Many critics argue that his greatest body of work was when he returned in the early 2000s. It was during this time that he showed the evolution of his art style, showcasing a bulkier Spider-Man throughout the covers of Amazing Spider-Man Volume 2, number 22 to 27. With just 1 year under his belt, Friends was given the responsibility of drawing Spider-Man in 1983's Spectacular Spider-Man number 80. After impressing, he would be promoted to illustrating the Amazing Spider-Man title a year later, which culminated in a 3-year run. During that time, Friends drew Amazing Spider-Man number 248, The Kid Who Collects Spider-Man, however is most famous for introducing the awesome but then controversial black symbiote costume to the Amazing Spider-Man series. Friends' version of the Wallcrawler adopted a leaner, meaner look that suited the black costume perfectly and paid homage to Ditko's original version. I must confess that my favourite era for Spider-Man is the 1980s, and Friends' artwork is a big reason for that. I am lucky enough to own a number of these comics, which include Amazing Spider-Man 258, 263 and 265. I am particularly keen on 258 and the dilemma Parker faces between the two costumes, symbolically visualised on the front cover. Another favourite from the 1980s is Charles Vess, who was famous for his bleak colours that gave the comics he illustrated a fairy tale look. Some of my favourite cover art by Vess included Web of Spider-Man number 1, Amazing Spider-Man number 261 and Amazing Spider-Man number 278. Vess was particularly skilled at illustrating the Hobgoblin, perfectly exhibited in the image you see here, which occupied a lot of time on my wall space over the years. In this image, Vess perfectly captures the Hobgoblin in motion, fleeing from and simultaneously attacking the black costume Spider-Man. Another superb artist from the 80s was Mike Zeck, who also drew the black costume in its origin story during 1984's Marvel Superhero Secret Wars Volume 1 number 8, as well as on the cover of Web of Spider-Man number 31 and 32. Aside from this, however, Zeck produced some even more impressive covers on the Kraven's Last Hunt story arc. Some of the covers you see here depicting the conflict between the black costume Spider-Man and Kraven have to be amongst my all-time favourites. When it comes to Spider-Man artists of the 80s, McFarlane would sign the decade off in style as he took the artwork to new levels. McFarlane would burst onto the scene in 1988 with Amazing Spider-Man number 298, introducing his detailed and dark style of line work, which took the comics into unprecedented levels of darkness. His hyper-detailed illustrations gave Spider-Man and his webbing a whole new visual style, which is clearly elucidated in his very own Spider-Man number 1. In addition to this, he would define and cement the iconic look of Venom, one of the most popular Spider-Man villains of all time. McFarlane's detail further emphasised the horrific nature of the comics, as can be seen in Amazing Spider-Man number 313, where you can literally see the saliva of the lizard as it attacked a bleeding Spider-Man. You may be able to argue with my opinion that McFarlane is one of the greatest Spider-Man illustrators ever, but you cannot argue with the facts. McFarlane remains the best-selling Spider-Man artist of all time. When Eric Larson took over from McFarlane, he would move away from the darker subject matter and constricted line work in order to return to the Silver Age roots of the character introduced by Ditko. Larson would introduce a colourful, action-packed, dynamic style that complemented teen heroes. After leaving the title at number 350, Larsen would later return to the character and has since established himself as one of the quintessential Spider-Man artists. As another one of my favourite Spider-Man artists, Mark Bagley had the unenviable task of taking over from Eric Larsen with Amazing Spider-Man number 345 in 1991. After penciling these pages, Bagley would go on to produce the cover art in Amazing Spider-Man number 351. Bagley's take on Spider-Man was more constrained than his predecessors, however his ability to create dynamic scenes without overpowering the reader was uncanny. In my humble opinion, Bagley's most defining piece of cover art that elucidated his iconic style was Amazing Spider-Man number 361. Aside from the beautiful deep contrast in colour, this comic introduced audiences to carnage. Over his 5-year run, Bagley would go on to illustrate 64 back-to-back issues and became Spider-Man's definitive artist of the time. Bagley would subsequently return to carve out a new era as he illustrated the character in the groundbreaking Ultimate Spider-Man. I would now like to take a short break from the comics to showcase the art of the Hildebrand brothers, who depicted the webcrawler in a series of trading cards in 1994. This magnificent artwork would go on to influence the costume in Sam Raimi's movies, giving the character a fresh, unique look. The widely acclaimed 1994 animated series placed Spider-Man in a colourful and bright New York that adopted a mini-movie feel with each episode. This colour palette perfectly complemented Spider-Man's own colour scheme as he swung across the CGI backgrounds. This series would go on for 5 seasons and remains as my second favourite cartoon after Batman the Animated Series. 1994 was a very significant year for the web-slinger as another version of him swung into action in the form of the Scarlet Spider. This costume moved away from the original but was still recognisable in its design. Stephen Butler's version of this character has to be my all-time favourite, as can be seen here in Web of the Scarlet Spider number 1. Butler offered the Scarlet Spider a more aggressive, angular and muscular design that complemented the dramatic covers on the comics like Web of Spider-Man number 118. Although this character is not Spider-Man, with artwork like this, he is certainly worth a mention. Brazilian comic book artist Mike Deodato would introduce readers to his original and refreshing take on Spider-Man. Deodato would present the webcrawler with an enlarged head and exaggerated body dimensions, giving him a bug-like appearance. He would draw the web-slinger in almost impossible body positions, augmenting his spider aspect. I am a big fan of his work throughout Amazing Spider-Man number 509 to 528 in particular. However, by issue number 524, he became less about drawing Spider-Man's exaggerated body proportions and more about the colour contrast on his front covers. Jeffrey Scott Campbell was another prominent cover artist on the Amazing Spider-Man comics, and his artwork from Volume 2, issues 30 to 36 were truly impressive. His final issue on this run did not possess the eponymous character on the cover at all, but was simply blacked out with the Amazing Spider-Man written in white. This was to convey the sad and shocking events of 9/11. Michael Turner is also an artist that I would like to draw attention to, simply for his work on SpiderMan Red Sonja. This odd pairing had a short 5-issue run in 2007, however the artwork was unforgettable, as can be seen here. The contrast of the modern and archaic gave the comics an eclectic feel not seen before. The final artist that I'd like to mention is on this exhibit for one piece of work. This is the awe-inspiring Spider-Man vs Green Goblin painting that beautifully captures the two antagonists in mid-battle as they almost leap off the explosive background. I must admit that this version of Spider-Man, with the exaggerated and elongated muscles, has to be up there with the best in my opinion. In fact, I have such an affinity for this piece that I actually have a copy which proudly sits on my office wall. That draws an end to this exhibition of the greatest Spider-Man artwork. I hope that I managed to include some of your favourite artists, but I cannot possibly discuss them all. Please put the names of your favourite Spider-Man artists in the comment section and let me know which other characters you'd like to see me discuss in my Portrait of a Superhero series. And before you say it, yes, the Batman issue is coming soon. If you enjoyed this video, then you may want to see the one I have on Superman, but if you want to stick with the web crawler, then take a look at the Rogues Gallery of Spider-Man, which looks at the artwork of some of his greatest foes. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to return with more content soon.